Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight we're going to be venturing into the world of the paranormal for a collection of scary stories from haunted houses. So buckle up, because it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I worked for a state forest service in the tri-state area several years ago, in a field location that was a farmhouse of over 250 years. The basement was dug in compacted earth. There were large fireplaces in several rooms, and few still even had pot hooks for heating water or cooking. There was one bathroom that had been installed in the 1940s. Prior to that, there had been none. The floorboards were wide slats of pine, and you could see the hand-forged nails holding them in place. In some areas, they were far enough apart that you could shine a flashlight down through the cracks and see into the basement floor. Mice and camel crickets were common there. They were just a fact of life that we lived with, as was the ancient oil furnace that we had in the basement that broke frequently. Another odd fact was that down in the dug earth basement, in the furthest and darkest corner, there was a dark room for developing film. I'd never even ventured into that room, it bothered me. Anyway, I'd always felt watched in there. It was a constant feeling that remained until I got into my car to leave for the night. There were oftentimes strange smells, sometimes like rose water and oranges that had warm associations, but sometimes like rotten garbage, especially when no trash was present. There was a kitchen that had been slightly modernized. On at least 2 occasions, all the cabinets and doors would be shut in the morning, and then as I was upstairs working in my office, I would hear them all open. I would go back down the stairs and find them wide open. The moment you walked in the door in the morning, it would be as if you felt eyes turn on you. One of our secretaries dealt with this by very loudly announcing good morning to the existing inhabitants, as she was often the first one in, and said she didn't necessarily feel threatened, but if she started hearing too many noises upstairs while she was alone, she would say out loud, "You should all know I don't want to be hearing this. I don't mess with you, so come on, don't mess with me." And on some occasions it would stop, but not always. The first time I remember seeing something physically, as I could usually hear and see images mentally but not with my physical eyes, was when we had meetings going on downstairs, and I ventured upstairs to fetch a chapstick out my bag. My back was to the main hallway, and all of a sudden I heard a set of footsteps rush past me. I turned and saw 2 shadowy people, one shorter than the other, flash down the hallway and into the back office, making footsteps the whole way. On another occasion concerning footsteps, our secretary and I were in the office on a winter morning, just the 2 of us, and the heat was broken again. We sat in the same room downstairs trying to stay warm, with a space heater. We couldn't use the fireplaces, as they were shut and hadn't been used for decades. We were laughing and talking when all of a sudden we hear a very loud boot clomping, running from the downstairs foyer up to the main stairs, and across the hallway upstairs directly over our heads to the opposite side of the house. We looked at each other and paused, but at that point, we had been used to these kind of shenanigans, and felt if we let it bother us, it wasn't the best scenario. We lost 2 cleaning people. In the evening, after the few of us had gone home, as we never had more than 6 in the office, and that was on a busy day, we had a cleaning service come to vacuum and try and help us out with the pest issue by assuring the trash was taken out. Each night the cleaning man was to fill out a journal that was left on my boss's cabinet to tell us what he did. After he'd been there a while, he told us in the journal that he heard his name being called while he was using the vacuum. This happened multiple times. He would turn the vacuum off, and it was silent. Finally, I guess he was brave. He said he knocked on the wall, and at first nothing happened. Then he knocked, "Shave a haircut," and there was a response of 2 knocks. He quit. My boss had a bad habit of working late in the house after dusk, and I would sometimes work with her, but we would never stay past 6:30 or so. It just wasn't a good idea. It was as though that was the house's time, and we didn't want to intrude on that, like a mutual respect. I know that sounds strange, Before she started putting a cap on her evening hours, one night she was working alone at her desk facing out into the hallway, when she saw a very tall shadow person pass by the door frame. Slowly, not runnings like the one I saw. She said it had to be at least 7 feet tall. It scared her badly. On another occasion she was working late, and a giant blue orb about the size of a soccer ball with electrical-looking energy coming off it went down the same hallway past her door and crashed into the metal filing cabinets we had at the end of the hallway. It made a lot of noise. On another occasion, this was in the afternoon, she was working on a project in our large meeting room, which had been a dining room at some point. She was engrossed in what she was doing, oblivious to her surroundings, when she looked up and locked eyes with a dark-haired man who appeared to be in his mid-40s in 19th century dress, with grey eyes. She said he looked about as surprised as she was to the fact that he saw her. But what was odd was that she saw daylight pass straight through him. He turned to go towards the main stairwell and vanished. She yelled out, understandably startled, and the secretary and I came running to see what was wrong. None of us saw him again, though we did give him a name based on what we knew of the house's history. In retrospect, I'm not sure the name was correct, but we tried to be respectful. In that same room, I was simply passing through one afternoon when I mentally heard a woman's voice say, with great agitation, "This is my house." A tired old trope, I know, but there is validity to it when considering the context. When a canal was being dug in the 1830s near the property, the state was purchasing tracts of land from residents in order to make room for the canal. Later in the 1960s, the state began purchasing large tracts of land in order to preserve them as state parks, one lot being where the house is located. I began leaving a recorder running overnight in different areas of the house, and there were two rooms where I recorded the most. One was in the oldest section of the house, the main one being the family room. The other, the servant's bedroom upstairs, one of which was my office. I should note that this house is located in a very rural area. There is a canal nearby that is only used for recreational kayaking and fishing, and a series of hiking and horse trails, but no city sounds or noise interference from neighbors. When I left the recorder downstairs in the family room, on multiple occasions I would play the recorder back the next day, and capture beautiful piano music. It sounded faint but clearly audible, classical music. We also experienced the scent of fresh pine in this room for no apparent reason over and over again. The other, far less happy sounds were of a gruff man's voice and the sound of at least 2 children crying. I could never make out what the man was saying, and I would be taking a guess as to what the children were saying, but it sounded an awful lot like, "I want my mummy." This is the most troubling memory I have of the house. No one likes to think that children suffered. I began going to the local hall of records for the township and doing some research, which was a great experience that I highly recommend, on the deed and wills associated with the various individuals who had owned the house through the generations. Most were handwritten and spoke of chain as a length of measure and stone markers or rock markings where the land boundaries were. I found out the names through the most recent families to live in the house in 1967, who by then was renting it from the state. One particular family had been on the property for nearly 100 years, and I had a chance of finding a living relative. I did, and I contacted her via email to ask her if she would like to visit the house, and she did. She was 88 at the time, but was a cousin of the family who was still living in the house in the 1930s, and she visited frequently as a child. Her mind was clear, and I asked her if the family room is where they would set up the Christmas tree and pointed to it, and she said yes. She knew that I had been doing some research on the house and asked if her uncle, who lived with the family but was unmarried and died in 1950 or so, played the piano, and she said yes, and that he played beautifully. She was a child and young teen there in the 1930s, and I didn't want to trouble or scare her with the details of what had been going on in the house. I just treated it like a nostalgic event for her. This obviously doesn't explain all the other myriad events in the house, including apparitions in clothing from different time periods, but it explained and verified two small pieces of the puzzle. We continued to have experiments there, as well as our contractors, such as two young men we hired to repair flashing on the roof, and they continuously blamed each other for tools disappearing and reappearing in strange unrelated places. We had to do our own cleaning because we couldn't retain a cleaning person. On yet another occasion, we had a visitor use the bathroom where there was a slated door closet facing the toilet. As she did her business, the closet door began to shake violently, and the doorknob rattled violently as though something was trying to escape from inside the closet. She was horribly scared that she jumped off the toilet and pulled her pants up without even using any paper. It was often mischievous, odd behavior. A few years later, we lost funding, and I had to move on to a different job. But I still see the house when I'm doing extensive bike rides in the area or on the canal towpath. The house, as a field location, also lost its funding, so it's been vacant for some years now.
This began in the year 1999, and I'd never had a paranormal experience before. I was aware of ghosts and paranormal things just from the movies and stories told from friends. But this happened when I was 16 and worked at a global fast food chain at the weekend while I was at school. It was Sunday, and I woke up as usual. The first thing I would do would be to turn on the radio. This is important. Remember, back in the 90s, to get your preferred station, you had to adjust the dial to tune into the FM frequency of your choice. Mine was always on FM Midland Radio 103. So I get up, turn the radio on, get dressed and go downstairs, getting ready for my 11 a.m. shift. I knew from the night before my mother and father and then 11-year-old sister were going out of town for the day, so I went downstairs for breakfast to an empty house and all was fine. I went to work, worked a full shift and then came home around 6 p.m. expecting to find my mother, father and sister there, but the house was empty. Anyway, I ran upstairs desperate to change out of my greasy clothes and take a shower. As soon as I went into my room, I began my usual habit, flick on the radio, and as soon as I turned the switch on, instead of Midlands 103, I got hard static, which confused me. So I went to investigate, and the dial had been adjusted to the very end of the FM radio dial. Naturally, I assumed it was my sister. She was always playing tricks and moving things and stealing my stuff in general and having mischief. I thought nothing more of it, and about half hour later the door opened and I heard my family talking as they entered through the front door. I went down a bit later and asked them where they'd been. My mother and father, after 2 or 3 minutes of questioning, assured me that they had just arrived home from the mall. I could tell they weren't lying, and my blood ran cold when I knew they were telling the truth, and I realized my sister hadn't been messing with my radio. In the weeks that followed, I started noticing something. I suppose the only way to describe it is a shadow in my bedroom. Just these really fast and brief shadows in the corner of my room. I would only leave 2 to 3 inches of my curtain open, so there was a tiny scope for anything to be reflecting from outside, casting shadows on my wall. There was nothing outside which could possibly be creating shadows. It was a dark back garden with trees, and I was on the first floor. To rationalize, I talked myself out of what was happening with the shadows, but it kept pestering me, night after night. On top of this, before falling asleep, I used to get this vibrating feeling like a shake, as if I was being prevented from falling asleep. This went on for weeks, and I started to have very bad sleep and even sleepless nights, countless of them. So this kept building and building, and my anxiety, coupled with me doubting my own sanity, was getting unhealthy. I tried confiding in my mother, who thought I was either lying for attention or high, but it got worse. I still have difficulty with this, but one night, when there was no tension or shadow or atmosphere, I turned to my left side and there she was. The only way I can describe her was that she appeared as a faint green hologram, the outline of a faint woman's body, long hands, long fingers right by her sides. I could see through her. It was hollow and transparent green, like I said. I was so scared I couldn't lift my head to look above her. I put the pillow over my head, said at least 30 of Our Father without stopping, and convinced myself she wasn't real. The incredible thing was after that night it was like the atmosphere changed. I never saw anything else or felt anything else. The room felt so much better after that. For background information, we moved into the house in '96, and the house was built in the mid-50s. The lady, who I am sure showed herself, was Mrs. Slater, who raised a family in the house long before we moved in. She had passed away several years prior to us moving in. I'd always been uncomfortable telling anyone about what happened, but one night, several years after my experience, me and my mother were having a nice chat, and I brought up how I resented the fact she never listens to me about what I went through in that room. She apologized and said she was really empathetic, which caught me off guard. When I asked her why she was so understanding, she stayed a bit quiet, and eventually admitted that one night in my old room, an ashtray came flying off the shelf and smashed into the wall, and then when she got up, a plastic cover from a radio thermostat flew out on its own towards her. She said that in the weeks before this happened, she could hear something whispering her name in the night. She admitted she was so terrified she was thinking to herself, just kill me and get it over with. And that was 5 years ago that we had this conversation. I brought up everything we spoke about last summer, and I asked if anything had happened since then. She said a few months prior that her electric shower started to turn on itself upstairs. To start the shower, you need to flick a power switch and then the shower switch. And my word, the shower was loud. So she told me that she ran to her next-door neighbor, which didn't surprise me, and she said that she heard an almighty thud one night in the attic, like someone slammed a big, heavy suitcase in the attic above her head. The only way into the attic is a very small hatch. I have no doubt there are spirits or entities attached to the house, and they're clearly capable of physical interaction. The odd times I stay there, I always keep the lights on.
I live in a 50-year-old apartment building, and a lot of strange stuff has happened here. A little background on what we believe is one of the ghosts haunting our building. When I was around 4 or 5, during a Christmas lunch, one of the neighbors had some friends over. One had been dealing with his parents' divorce and struggled with depression. He told my neighbor he needed to use the bathroom, locked himself in a bedroom, and before anyone could stop him, jumped, ending his own life. I saw him fall that day. I felt sorry for him and my neighbor. We'd never forgotten, and we felt so bad for not noticing earlier. Fast forward a few months, I was watching Digimon in the small studio. My mum and grandma were in the kitchen making dinner, and I heard a female voice calling my name. At least that's what I thought. So I muted Digimon since I wanted to clearly understand if my mum was calling me. And right then and there, I hear the female voice humming. It was a new episode of Digimon, and I didn't know if it was a character humming, as I thought the TV had something wrong with it. It was supposed to be muted, right? Well, I was about to tell my parents that the TV wasn't working properly when I noticed the sound wasn't coming from the TV, but right next to it, half a meter away. But there was nothing. I got scared and ran to the kitchen. My mum went and said there was nothing wrong with the TV. 10 years ago, we started noticing weirder stuff happen. Our security guards would tell us that they kept seeing a white figure come out of the parking lot area and stand up in front of pedestrians. It would sit and sometimes fly towards the sky. It would sometimes follow people to try to get their attention. It was all captured on the cameras. This has since stopped, as all the cameras were upgraded. Several guards have been scared by loud screaming in their yards. They have heard whistling in the parking lots. Of course they check everywhere, but it's so late at night that it wasn't a child pranking them. They even heard whistling and the source of sound moving from place to place, and even seemingly going towards the sky. It wasn't the wind, as those were windless nights. People have heard their names being called by male and female voices. A dark figure has appeared multiple times in the basement, scaring the neighbors. I've seen a little girl running in my apartment. She wears a white dress, has straight black hair, and seems to be between 7 and 4 years old. Nobody has died at that age in my building. The most annoying thing that happened was a few years ago. During 2 months, my dog would wake me up in between 3:10 and 3:43 a.m. every single day. I couldn't sleep properly as I had a lot of work from high school. The thing is, my dog barked like crazy. He was scared. He wouldn't stop barking and wouldn't move from the front door. I called the security guard, asking if he'd heard any doors opening prior to my dog barking, or if a neighbor had arrived drunk, but he denied anything. I still asked him to keep an eye out in case there was a sleepwalker, and that was my hypothesis for the first 2 weeks. That's when I began to lose my mind. I couldn't sleep, and I had to lock my dog in my bedroom and hug him until he felt safe. I would take at max 2 hours, and then had to get ready for school. After a while, my dad and I noticed that before my dog started barking, the automatic lights from the floor would turn on, as if someone was going upstairs. It stopped at our floor, and the dog would bark like crazy. My dad swung the floor open trying to find a neighbor, probably the culprit of our 2-week nightmare, but there was no one. My dog stood in the doorframe shaking, showing his teeth and barking in fear. He wouldn't come near the wall. This went on for 6 more weeks, and I couldn't let my dog sleep in my room as he would start barking away. It drove me insane. I'm pretty sure none of my neighbors slept too, but it's been so mad that I literally screamed at the ghost to leave me and my dog alone, and that I would pray for him to go to heaven. It stopped after a while, but it was nuts. Back in the early 90s, we used to live in Dundry, a small village in the UK. On the opposite side of our house is an old church that was built in the 15th century. They used to bury criminals outside of the cemetery. Where the houses we rented were built in the 18th century, it was quite a big L shape, with 2 wings and 2 floors, and the house was originally a butcher's house. Anyway, our parents went on a holiday, so my atheist uncle came to babysit me and my sister, who were 3 and 4 years old at the time. After my uncle had finished putting us to bed, he went to relax in our guest room, which was next to the bottom of the staircase that leads to the upper wing, where me and my sister shared a room. All was quiet for a few hours, and in the early hours of the morning my uncle was up. He starts hearing faint creaking sounds coming from the upstairs hallway, and thought nothing of it. After a while, he hears those creaking sounds again, but this time a bit louder, and went upstairs to investigate, as he thought me or my sister had gotten up to use the bathroom. He checks our room and sees that we are both asleep in our beds, and goes back down to the guest room. It was silent for a while, and he starts hearing that creaking sound again from the hallway upstairs, and gets to go have a look for the second time. As he's climbing the stairs, he realizes that the creaking sounds turn into footsteps. Those footsteps are coming from the left hallway, take a right turn and start coming down the stairs towards him. My uncle leans against the railing, and the footsteps walk past him and continue down the end of our hallway into our living room, where the fireplace was. He started freaking out, turned on all the downstairs lights, and waits for a while. The sound stopped, and he didn't hear them again. When he told my parents, they told the local priest to come to our house and give it a blessing. Apparently those footsteps were never heard again. Our uncle and parents only told this story later when we were older. I think it's really interesting, since I'm very skeptical to the paranormal, especially my uncle. This story is about my grandmother's house. She lives in the UK and had a big old house with a huge garden. The house is quite old, as most of the houses in the UK are, so it was dark and a bit damp. My family is quite large, so whenever there was an event or holiday, we would always gather there to celebrate. There was this unspoken rule as a small child to never roam around the house by yourself, especially at night, and to not look into the rooms too hard, as you may see something creepy look back. In particular, there was this one little hallway that connected the front hallway to the kitchen in the back, and it had the laundry stuff in there. There was one spot in the hallway that no matter what time of day, light just wouldn't hit. We all felt there was something there, so we ignored it and avoided being in the corridor for more than a few seconds to run through. I never saw anything there as a kid, but I always got the feeling that if I looked at the wrong time, there would be something looking back at me. Later, my dad told me it was an old bathroom he built for my grandparents that was never used because they felt something wanted the space more than they did. I don't know. It was there for over 20 years. Eventually, we moved away from the UK, so it's been like 18 years, and we returned for some family affairs. My dad stayed with his mum and brother at my grandma's place, my uncle being my grandma's caretaker, so they're happy to have my dad there to help restore the house, while the rest of us can't stay because it's too dusty and cluttered. A few days into the trip, my dad said he was having trouble sleeping, and one night he could have sworn he saw someone sitting on his dresser watching him sleep. When he explained the weird feeling he got in the house, my uncle told him that it probably was there watching him, and that he's seen things too over the years. He said that he'd seen a little girl run down the hall and into the wall at the bottom of the stairs a few times, and a huge image of a man's face staring at him in the living room on top of shadows, moving around and talking while it's only him and my grandma in the house. He goes on to say that the house used to be a much bigger estate, that it was separated into two homes. The front door used to be where that little girl kept running into the wall. My uncle smudges the place every week to stop weird things from happening, but that week he was so busy he didn't get to do it. So now for my experience with the house. When we first went to visit during that time, my dad seemed weary of us being alone for too long in any of the rooms while he was fixing parts of the house. At one point, my uncle shows us the attic, and we all took turns popping our heads out to see the work they've done. But when it gets to my turn, I suddenly feel like something's watching me. I look around a bit as I start turning to feel my neck gets rough and stiff, like someone's crouching behind me where my head was propped up. My mind's going nuts, telling me something's behind me, but I don't look back. It wants me to look. Then I freeze. I slowly climb down the ladder and try to look calm, but my little sister can't tell I was shaken, and she tells me that in my grandma's room there was a spot in the corner where something was watching us and it felt angry. By that point we were all tired, and everyone could feel the tense atmosphere, so we cut our visit short that day and went home. But my dad stayed there, and he felt it too, especially at night, so he tried to never be alone there the whole time he remained. Me and my best friend hung out with another girl when we were younger. My best friend Kayla and the other girl Summer. Summer's house was one of the original houses built in our city, probably around 1830. We loved going to her mum's room because she had a huge bed and the ceilings were very high and lined with vintage suitcases. I don't know why, but the whole family is super into fashion and vintage everything. So, anyway, we're like 10 and finished watching a movie on there and started jumping on the bed like hooligans. After a minute or so, we realized there were 4 of us on the bed. We immediately stopped and a shadow flew out the door. We didn't really go back in there until 9th grade. The 3 of us came back to Summer's house late one night after a concert. I don't know why she did this, but she has tons of mirrors set up all over at certain angles, so no matter where you are in the room, you can always see everything around you. She said it was because her house was haunted, and after all of this, I believe her. We were laying in bed watching TV, when in the mirror, the light in her closet turns on, and the door begins to open, and there's the large black shadow of a man standing there. Turning around, there's nothing in the closet. In the mirror, it's still there though. A month or so later, Summer and I were skipping school with another friend who we'd never hung out with outside of school before. As we turned into Summer's walkway, this friend goes, "Is that your brother in the window?" We looked up at the bedroom window and saw the same dark, shadowy figure standing there. Sure enough, we went in and no one was home. Summer was obviously fed up and freaked out, so she asked her mum, who turned as white as a sheet. She told Summer that when she was young, she would see the shadow all over her room. Summer's grandmother cleaned the room with holy water and prayed for them to go away, and she never saw them again. Recently, she started doubting her faith, and she began seeing them once again. We ended up drifting apart through high school, and the last I heard, she moved away. I would have too, if that were my house.
The house I'd lived in since I was 8 was horribly haunted. Let me give you some background. It was built somewhere in the middle of the 1800s and has belonged to my family since the start. My great-great-grandparents built it from scratch when they moved from Italy to Uruguay. The backyard occupied an entire block, so it was pretty big. During the years, the family began to sell some parts of it, and is now only a quarter of what it used to be. The house served as many things: a cinema, 2 churches, a bar, a clandestine abortion center, and many more stores. Sadly, a lot of people have died here, including murders, natural deaths, and suicides. The previous owners, some family friends, said that the last nights they spent here were almost unbearable. Doors and windows would open and close alone, so fast they had to get out as quickly as they could, and the neighbors always told us they could hear babies crying in the backyard, where they used to bury fetuses. Cousins of my mother had seen people in the bathroom mirror plenty of times, and smells would appear out of nowhere. A pretty messed up place. We moved in 2010, and almost immediately things started to happen. Stuff would be missing from the places where we'd left them. We could hear conversations in a different language in the backyard at night, but after searching there was no one. But the thing that creeped the hell out of us were the apparitions. A few months after moving in, my mother woke up in the middle of the night, only to find there was a man at the end of her bed, with a black plastic bag covering his head. She didn't scream nor woke me up, just closed her eyes and prayed until she fell asleep again. This became a regular thing. We would always see different people at any time in the house, and they'd vanish into thin air. There was also the time when I went to sleep over at my cousin's house. That was the same as ours, but divided by a wall. And I woke up at about midnight and saw a woman watching me from behind a full-body mirror. I couldn't move, so I shut my eyes, and when I opened them, she wasn't there anymore. I was relieved momentarily, only to look across the room to the bedroom door, and she was there again. I closed my eyes, and this time, when I opened them again, she was gone. Stuff like this happened all the time. We ended up contacting a medium, and she informed us that the house actually had 6 different presences living in it. I'm so glad I don't live there anymore. This all started after I first moved out of my hometown and came to London. The apartment block was modern, red brick, and a nice place in a leafy part of North London. The first weird thing that happened was my South African person I shared the apartment with asked me one evening why I was walking so slowly to the bathroom last night, that my footsteps were so slow, and he wanted to know in a jokey way if I was sleepwalking. I knew for a fact I didn't go to the bathroom and just jokingly brushed it off. Funny thing was, I heard weird slow footsteps on the floorboards at different times, but thought nothing much of it. Several weeks after this, another weird thing happened. I used to have this little lamp. It was like these metal tubes with lights on the top. It was small, but it was a nice little bedside reading lamp, more decorative than functional. The thing is, to turn it off, you had to press the switch on the electrical cord. I remember waking up one morning when I categorically remember switching it off before I fell asleep. I have an excellent memory and wasn't drinking or anything at all. And I woke up, and it was on. Very strange. The craziest thing to come was a few months earlier. I had returned late on a Sunday evening from a weekend in Europe with my friends. I got home, turned on the TV, and sat on the floor and rested with my back against the sofa. I then decided to open a can of beer and looked at the TV. What happened next was insane. But it happened. A pillow from the sofa came over to my head and landed directly on the tin of beer between my legs and spilled all over the carpet. I ran into the front door and started hyperventilating. It was honestly terrifying. I used to live alone, which made it so much worse. I needed the TV on. Every light in the house was on, and I was in a constant state of paranoia after that. Things calmed down, and occasionally I would get these feelings like I wasn't alone. An atmosphere, unpleasant and hard to describe. One night, I came back from the city center after my birthday. It was late. I went to go to bed and of course the house was fully lit up. Just as I was starting to get into the sleepy zone, I heard this knock-knock. It was the indisputable sound of a knuckle hitting a hollow door. If it was one knock, I could have questioned myself, but there was intelligence there. It was done right beside my room. It sounded like it was next door. I froze. I just couldn't take it anymore. I started looking for a new house share and was gone within 2 weeks. After all my experiences accumulating up, I started realizing I was paranormal sensitive. I subsequently found out the building was originally built for the mentally ill and was sold off to developers in the 70s. Go figure. We moved into a new home rental. We had just moved most of our stuff into the house, but had not yet unpacked, and most of our things were still in the main room on the ground floor. My mother wanted to check out the park nearby, and took my brother and 2 sisters with her while I decided to stay home to help my dad unpack. We had a cat that had given birth to 6 kittens, and we also had a dog. While we were unpacking, the dog had hidden under the couch, which was a bit strange, but we thought that perhaps he was just scared of being in a new place. But then the kittens started hissing and puffing up their fur at presumably nothing. And then we heard a weird noise coming from upstairs, which happened to be the directions the kitten were facing while they were starting to hiss. My dad immediately thought that perhaps there was a squatter or intruder. He grabbed a baseball bat and told me to stay put. He comes back shortly after and is white as a sheet. He told me to come with him, and in one of the rooms upstairs he showed me an old wooden chair, which was not unusual. But what was in the chair had a perfect circle worn in the wood, as if the chair had spun on one leg and worn into the wood. There was fresh sawdust still in the groove. My father said that when he went into the room, the chair was moving on its own, and stopped a moment after he opened the door. A lot of other weird stuff happened after that. A few times pictures flew off the wall. We would hear people talking in the hallway at night in hushed voices or random bangs in the walls. We moved out only after a year, because the cumulative experiences of these incidents were just all too creepy. My detached childhood home was definitely haunted, and it gives me the goosebumps just thinking about it. Our whole family would be downstairs watching TV or eating dinner, just sitting around, and everyone would hear very clear footsteps on the second floor, pacing back and forth. My parents used to tell my sister and I that because of the pipes were connected between the homes, we could hear the footsteps of the neighbors. I didn't think it made sense, but sure. When I was buying my first house, I casually mentioned to my mum I hope I wouldn't be able to hear the neighbors walking in their homes. That's when she remembered that it was the lie they told me and my sister so that we wouldn't be scared.
My sister and I had lots of nightmares growing up, and Mum didn't think it would be a good idea to tell us that she was also scared of the ghosts and that they existed. My mum said that from the way the footsteps sounded, it sounded as if when my grandma, my father's mum, was alive, and that it would pace upstairs to get me to fall asleep. My dad always found it comforting to hear the noise of footsteps pacing back and forth after his mum passed, so I guess that's why no one made a big deal out of it. Hey guys, it's Mort here. Thank you so very much for listening. Well done for making it to the end, you absolute champion. A huge thank you to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. If you'd like some extra perks for signing up to either of these two things, feel free. You get some cool bonus stuff, like interviews with my wife, funny questions, some bonus stories occasionally. So yeah, give it a think. I hope you liked today's haunted house stories. It's fun. My wife is going to give birth any day now. Who knows? I could be at the hospital right now. So yeah, it's we've been a bit on edge. But yes, I do hope that you liked today's stories. But let's wrap it up here. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.